250 years ago, the center of the community, it wasn't what you think. It isn't a church. It isn't a park. It isn't a set of stores. It was the tavern. That's where everything happened. You might get a drink in a tavern, obviously, and you might get food, but also you're gonna get your mail there. You might go to church there or to court. An 18th century tavern is an amazing place to visit. The 18th century tavern might go by a lot of different names. It might be an ale house, it might be a public house, it might be an inn, or even an ordinary. All these things referred to something like the same thing, although there are some nuances in those definitions. The lowest of the low is probably the ale house. That is the classic thing that we think of when we think of an 18th century tavern. Kind of low, smoky, filled with nefarious characters. That's certainly an ale house in the 18th century. If you want something much more high class, especially if you're in some place like London or a big city, those taverns are going to be very fancy places, maybe not even letting in those lower class people. A place where you're gonna get a fancy meal and it's probably a big room like a restaurant today. That might be a tavern in the 18th century. But most taverns are somewhere in the middle. A place where you can get a meal and it lets in regular people for those drinking sessions, as well as a place where you might get entertainment. You certainly will do business transactions. So a tavern can be a lot of different things in the 18th century. Now a tavern today is probably a place you're just gonna go and unwind, a simple corner tavern. And there were many of those in the 18th century. And they were the kind of place where, well, bad things do happen. So crime in the 18th century seems to be almost centered around the tavern. We don't have a lot of easy documentation for that, except when we look at the records of the Old Bailey. This is in England, and these records go back into the 1600s. And if you search the word tavern, you're going to find lots and lots of references to crimes going on in and around the taverns of Great Britain. There's plenty of theft. There's a lot of violence. Lots of bad things are going on in taverns. But along with that, the tavern also has all sorts of people in it. Not just your standard working class men, but women will go into the tavern. You might see children in the tavern. So it is truly a community kind of center. At almost any tavern, you might get more than just a drink. It's very, very likely you'll get a meal, even if it's maybe the simplest meal possible, but you can probably get food. At most taverns, you can probably get some lodging too, but it's probably not the lodging that you're looking for today. Lodging was very primitive in the 18th century. You might just get a spot on the floor in the kitchen for the night, or even a spot in the barn, but it's more likely that they had a room set aside just for lodging. You might even get lucky enough to get a spot in the bed, but it's not very common that you would get a bed by yourself. So you might have to share the bed with 2 or 3 other people. In almost every location that I was looking at in North America or Great Britain, there were rules, there were laws about the taverns. Specifically, and it usually started with the idea of who could apply to have a tavern. Not just anybody could have a tavern, and you couldn't just open a tavern without any kind of permission from the government. So usually the person who was applying for this had to be an upstanding member of the community. No fly-by-night person from the outside could just come and open up a tavern. And there were rules that had to do with, let's say, a security deposit. You had to have a bond that you would pay so that if you were a bad tavern keeper, they could take your money away. There were also rules about the kind of people that could come into your tavern. Early on in Pennsylvania, they wanted to outlaw the idea of taverns in general. But people were traveling through the area and they really needed a place to stay. So they had taverns in Pennsylvania. But they did make laws that said local people couldn't spend too much time in the tavern. They didn't want local working men to just go into the tavern and spend all their money and spend all their time in the tavern. So there was a very limited aspect to that. But travelers could stay. They would have lodging and, of course, eat and drink in the tavern. You might see children serving in a tavern, and they occasionally might show up in the tavern if they were eating with their family. I doubt that happened a lot, certainly not children by themselves. So what about the drinks we're going to find in the 18th century tavern? Some ale houses were restricted. They could only have beer and cider. But most places more likely would serve you beer and cider. You're certainly going to be able to get wine, or let's say more intense spirituous liquors. Something like brandy, whiskey, rum. Those are all going to be available in your typical kind of tavern. More rural and sort of down on the heel taverns might have a very, very molassesy kind of beer, something that could be brewed locally and very, very inexpensively. Probably the most common drink in the 18th century. And in North America, cider is going to be very common also for a standard tavern drink. Now, if you don't have a lot of money, the most inexpensive drink, you're going to be drinking a small beer. Basically a very watered down beer. Beer that's made from the ingredients that's already been brewed once, and maybe this is the second or third time it's been used to make beer, so a very thin beer. Your low-end tavern in the 18th century is going to be a pretty rough and dirty spot to visit. I don't know if it would meet most of today's standards for cleanliness. They generally were dark and smoky. They would rarely have enough utensils. So if you were eating, you're probably going to be using your hands. And if you've got bones or whatever, you just throw it on the floor for the dogs. That's not uncommon to hear about in the 18th century. As a center of the community, the tavern is where you're going to find entertainment, especially entertainment that has traveled into the area. Taverns are where those traveling entertainers are going to go to, so you might find slack rope walkers, people balancing swords. I'm not sure exactly how that worked out. Puppet shows, magic lantern shows, which would be sort of like a slide show, but that's pretty high tech for the 18th century. You're also going to have people teaching penmanship and all sorts of weird kinds of entertainment. If you're in 18th century America and you're going to find an elephant, well, it's probably outside of a tavern. So people would have, animal exhibits. They might even show scientific experiments in the tavern. So you never know what you might find if you go visit a tavern. Madam Knight in the early 18th century, the 1720s, is traveling by herself on horseback up the East Coast, and she's stopping at many different inns and taverns along the way. And she has these crazy adventures she writes about in her diary. And she has a lot of different food adventures that she's having in these places. So let's hear about just a few of them. Here's one spot where she says that the food was so bad that she went to bed supperless. She didn't like the smell of it as soon as it came to the table. Another spot, she said, our usual food had a strong smell of head sauce. Don't have any idea what she meant by that. Another one she stayed at, there was a twisted thing like a cable, but something whiter. I think she meant a loaf of bread, possibly, and a dish of pork and cabbage, but it had a purple sauce. Maybe it was made with red cabbage and she was totally unfamiliar with it. But she thought that possibly the person had cooked it in the same kettle that they used to dye clothing in. Hopefully that wasn't the case. In Dr. Alexander Hamilton's journal in the middle of the 18th century, he describes many different times when he stops at taverns or inns, and he gives us some very, very in-depth descriptions of it so we can get this wonderful picture. So here is a spot that he's staying. This is June 8th. He says, I dined at a tavern with very mixed company of different nations and religions. There were Scots, English, Dutch, Germans, Irish. There were Roman Catholics and churchmen, Presbyterians, Quakers, and Methodists. The whole company consisted of 25 planted around a long oblong table in a great hall, well stoked with flies. The company divided into committees in conversation. The prevailing topic was politics and conjectures of a French war. A knot of Quakers there talked only about selling flour and the low price it bore. They touched a little upon religion, and high words arose among some of the sectaries, but their blood was not hot enough to quarrel or to speak in a canting phrase. Their zeal wanted fervency. A gentleman that sat next to me proposed a number of questions concerning Maryland, understanding that I came from thence. In my replies, I was reserved, pretending to know little of the nature as a being whose business did not lie in the way of history or politics. The names of taverns are fascinating. I love the names of taverns. So I went through the Old Bailey records, looking at the mentions of where all these crimes were happening and what taverns they were in. So we have the Rose Tavern, the Cross Keys Tavern, the Half Moon Tavern, the Green Dragon, the Crown Tavern, there's Castle, the Bull's Head Tavern, Horn Tavern, George Tavern, Sun Tavern. I like this one at the bottom, 3 Ton Tavern. The ton is like a big barrel, so it had a picture of 3 barrels. The Red Lion Tavern, the Noah's Ark Tavern, the Devil Tavern or Young Devil Tavern, and the Vulture Tavern. So I thought these were fascinating names. They all came from England, and I thought that was interesting. But then when I went searching in advertisements for New York taverns, I found almost all those same names. So people are coming over from England and they're naming their taverns after the taverns they had back home. It's likely that the tavern in the community is one of the largest public buildings, especially the first public building that is set up in a small community. So before a church is even built, well, there's going to be a tavern. And so church might happen at the tavern. And if there isn't any other community building, well, then court is going to happen there. And it's the hub of all kinds of thoughts and gossip. So you're going to get all this political discussion like Alexander Hamilton was talking about, but also it's the spot where travelers are coming through. So when a traveler comes through, everybody catches him. If you want news from local colonies or colonies from afar away, you're going to try to find those travelers to talk to get that kind of news. That's exactly what's happening to Alexander Hamilton. He's from Maryland and he's traveling through New York. So people want to find out about Maryland. They're going to try to, grab his ear and find out what's happening. I have people ask me all the time, whether it's in the comments or in a live stream, if I was going to use a time machine and go back into history, where would I go? What would I do? I would visit an 18th century tavern. There is no place that's going to bring in all the different kinds of people and all the different kinds of discussion and all the different kinds of entertainment like an 18th century tavern.